Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Jocelyn Rosnick, and I'm Policy Director for the ACLU of Ohio. Thank you for joining us for today's virtual unveiling of our latest report, Ohio State House to Prison Pipeline, the 133rd General Assembly. Our State House to Prison Pipeline reports highlight the unfortunate prevalence in Ohio of legislation introduced and passed by members of both parties to create new crimes, enhance existing sentences, and expand current criminal laws to include new situations and actors. Here to discuss the State House to Prison Pipeline and mass incarceration generally in Ohio, we have Gary Daniels, Chief Lobbyist at the ACLU of Ohio, Tim Young, the Ohio Public Defender, and Micah Derry, Executive Director for Americans for Prosperity Ohio. We regret that Fred Ward with the Ohio Organizing Collaborative cannot join us as previously scheduled, but I think we all need flexibility and grace in the virtual pandemic world that we're currently living in. So with that, we'll start with a few brief remarks from our panelists before opening it up to Q&A from the audience. So with that, let's dive in. Gary, I'd like to begin with you. This is the third full report that you've worked on for the State House to Prison Pipeline. I'm wondering if you can share the major takeaways with us.
Sure. Thank you, Jocelyn. Thank you, everybody, especially Tim and Micah, for doing this. We all come at this, I think, from the same general direction. This problem of mass incarceration in Ohio and all of the ills that it leads to. So, as Jocelyn mentioned, this is now the third consecutive session of the General Assembly where we have released this report. And when you look at the report, you'll be able to see now, since it covers 6 years, these three reports, you'll be able to see and track certain trends. I don't know if those trends necessarily mean anything, but I will get to that in a second. Some broad takeaways, though, about this particular report and past General Assembly. First, we are always diligent in trying to get this report out in a timely way, which involves between the end of lame duck in mid to late December and today, or actually when the report was sent to the printer, looking through 1,194 bills to find the legislation that does, as Jocelyn mentioned, create new crimes, enhance sentences, and expand current law. So the broad takeaway is, look, this particular session we know was an odd session, and how exactly it affected the State House to Prison Pipeline, I don't know that we can exactly say. And of course, the two giant variables affecting this past session were COVID-19 and the House scandal involving then Speaker Householder, First Energy, HB6, all of that, which obviously was taking up a bunch of oxygen over at the State House. But we don't know exactly how it impacted the legislation that was introduced and passed. But when you combine those two things, COVID plus the whole HB6 mess, you have obviously less lawmakers in there talking in person, a lot of their attention diverted towards COVID-19 bills, both explicitly and implicitly, and just on the House side trying to sort out all of the controversy going on over there. I'm happy to report, I don't know if it's exactly on purpose or not, but I'm happy to report there were no what I call, refer to like truly bad big bills this time around. We don't like any of these types of bills, but we are careful to distinguish between those bills that have the effects that we talk about and those that are really going to send more people to prison for longer periods of time, that are really going to pack our prisons and cause a noticeable increase because of one bill, not because of a collection of bills. So we didn't see that for whatever reason, and we hope that remains true. With this report, we also highlight some good bills that passed this past General Assembly, and that's a good thing. We were compelled to do that this time around because there was a collection of positive bills that, while I wouldn't frame any of these as reform with a capital R, they do certainly improve an existing system in good ways. Those bills are, just very briefly, House Bill 136, the death penalty severe mental illness bill, Senate Bill 256 involving juvenile sentencing and life without parole, House Bill 263 involving professional licenses and people with felony records. House Bill 285, a driver's license amnesty program, making that permanent because of the number of people that lose their licenses and can't afford to get them back in Ohio, drive around with suspended licenses and cause sort of a snowball effect in the criminal justice system for people. And finally, the last one we highlight is House Bill 1, which expands alternatives to sending people to prison, expands record sealing, and did some other things such as banning unnecessary shackling of people in courts, jails, and prisons when they are pregnant or giving birth or postpartum. So this is good news that we had this noticeable collection of good bills passed during this General Assembly, covering sort of a broad range of topics under that mass incarceration umbrella. But of course, we call this report the State House to Prison Pipeline. So there is some bad news that I would like to cover briefly. What the report indicates is that the pipeline hasn't essentially slowed down. In fact, if you look at the last 3 sessions of the General Assembly, the Senate is getting worse. They are continually introducing more and more pipeline bills to put more people in prison and jail. It has increased over the past 3 legislative sessions, and the House kind of goes back and forth, within a certain range of bills, but the Senate is where we have noticed it's certainly the impact is much bigger than it is in the House. Senate Bill 3, the bill regarding primarily drug sentencing for many drug possession crimes, that of course did not pass, despite the efforts of many to get it done. And that is really because of the reluctance, let's say, of Speaker Cupp and Governor DeWine. The reason that bill did not pass. Other bad news we highlight in the report that the good news is Senate Bill 55 did not pass. That was a bill involving trafficking of drugs near treatment locations that was written in such a way that it applies very broadly beyond treatment locations, and would have been a truly bad bill to pack our prisons if it had passed. The bad news is that Senate bill, and the only reason Senate Bill 55 ultimately probably did not pass is because they decided to add some language, the ongoing debate between the governor and the legislature about COVID-19 authority. And so they tacked some of that to Senate Bill 55, sent it to the governor, and he vetoed it. There was some more back and forth trying to get it passed in a different way, but ultimately it did not pass. The bad news is that bill is back again this session as Senate Bill 25, and the ACLU of Ohio will continue to battle against it. Finally, in the bad news category, again, 1,194 bills were introduced, and not a single one of those bills, despite dozens and dozens of them, again, explicitly or implicitly addressing COVID-19, not a single one of those almost 1,200 bills had anything to do with our prison population and getting people out of prison and making our prisons safer. As a result of the ongoing human rights crisis in Ohio prisons as it relates to COVID-19. There have been anywhere from, let's say, 130 to 133 deaths, 130 for sure in the prison system because of COVID-19, and 10 staff deaths. We continue to be up near the top of the nation with regard to our COVID deaths in prisons, and it's just absolutely perplexing and shameful that the General Assembly last session could introduce almost 1,200 bills, and not a single one of them has anything to do with COVID-19 in our prison system or in our jails, our juvenile facilities, and what have you. So with that, I will turn it back over to Jocelyn and our other panelists, and of course, we'll be here throughout for any questions and answers.
Thank you, Gary. So what I'm hearing is, sadly, the State House to Prison Pipeline in Ohio is alive and well. And I'd like to turn to Tim to ask about this, because many Ohio legislators say they want criminal justice reform, or that they support it. And they want to reduce Ohio's prison population that has been over capacity for years and years. I'm wondering what's happening here. Where's the disconnect?
Boy, I wish I could put my finger on it and it was a simple answer, because if it were that simple, we could solve it and move on. I think the disconnect sometimes is largely between the immediacy of the need to do something as a politician for your constituency versus the reality of a criminal justice system that has been tinkered with and used to pass bills that don't necessarily improve anything, but respond to the news item of the day. We pass so many bills that are named after somebody. And so we're passing bills in the heat of the moment to punish broad swaths of people because of an incident that made very big news. And they're usually very horrible incidents, not saying they're not, but we already punished them. We already sent people to prison for long periods of time. So every time we do that, all we're really doing is adding more, because we need to satisfy some instinct to punish. And because it's not, we don't have any new way to do it, we add a new way. And we create this huge disconnect between what the data tells us. And I think that's what you're hearing from legislators. In the calm moments when we're not doing 6 o'clock news legislation, when the calm moments and we talk about the data, the criminal justice system has rich amounts of data available to it today. And I worry when we talk about calling it reform, that is also part of the problem, because it's not reform at this point. The data tells us it's just correction. We just need to correct back to some proper approach to criminal justice. More time is not the answer. And all of the data tells us that. I think this is an opportunity for the legislature. When you look at this, they keep introducing bills, I think largely due to COVID. And I think a lot of those calmer moments, because so many of those bills weren't named after somebody, they were able to consider them more calmly and look at the data and understand that we don't need these bills. We don't need to pass these bills. But the problem is they're still bringing them. And the next time we have a 6 o'clock news issue, we're going to have another named bill in the criminal justice system that will add more people to our prison system, people who were already going to go and were already going to stay for very long amounts of time, given the types of crimes we're talking about in those cases. But I think it's the other end of the spectrum that we really have to focus on, because that's where the data tells us we're actually making Ohio unsafe. When we send thousands of people on these low-level crimes, these non-violent property crimes and mostly drug crimes. Drug possession is still our #1 intake into our prison system for addiction. Those people, low-level, non-violent offenders going in, prison makes them more dangerous. That's what the data tells us. And when we keep doing that, we make our communities more dangerous. We send somebody to prison for 6 months or 9 months. 6 months or 9 months later, that means they're coming home. And we want them to come home recovered, not more dangerous. And that's what's happening is because of the way our system works, we're not able to provide appropriate treatment. We're not able to provide connections to community that will help people maintain more stable lives. We send them and put them in prisons, and then we bring them home more dangerous to our communities. Finally, and I will stop fairly quickly here, I think it's really important to note the opportunity that we do have, because COVID has taught us the lesson that we don't need 50,000 people in Ohio's prisons. For years, we have played with that 50,000 number, which is just a stunning number for the number of people in Ohio. Per capita population, we imprison at very high rates in Ohio. But because of COVID and because they stopped doing intake into the prisons for a long time, and that meant the jails then stopped taking a lot of people in as well, and everybody's trying to maintain better distance, even without any real assistance from the legislature or large release numbers, because the pipeline in got stopped, not because of legislative action, but simply because of good, safe decisions by those who oversee our prisons. They stopped taking people in. We're now down, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the population today is in the 43,000s. And my question to everybody is, do you feel any more unsafe? And I don't know anybody who feels more unsafe with 7,000 fewer people in prison. And that's what, if there's any teeny silver lining of COVID, it's, at least in the criminal justice system, it's that it's taught us we don't need that many people in prison, and we certainly can't go back to that. We have got to change that wasteful system. It's throwing away money, it's throwing away lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. I really like that you hit on the notion of support versus control, right? There are individuals that could be receiving support from the state, getting the help and the care and the resources that they need, rather than ending up as another number in a cage in Ohio. And I do think there's something we can learn from the reductions that we have seen due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's sad to say that Gary dropped it in the chat, the population's sitting around 43,000, and it's still woefully over capacity, a system that was built to house 37, 38,000 years and years ago. So those are all great points. I'd like to turn to Micah now. So we tried something new in our latest version of the State House to Prison Pipeline Report. We looked at some positive bills that passed, and then obviously had to look at all of the pipeline bills too. Did anything good happen this time around? I'm wondering if, from your perspective, the pipeline is out of control, or if we're starting to see some balance.
Well, thank you, Jocelyn. I think that the greatest thing that we're meeting right now is what may be the beginning of a watershed moment within the legislature. We're currently in that moment where we're looking back at where we have come from in the legislature's culture, and looking at what is possible moving forward. Gary did a great job touching on the positive things that happened in the last General Assembly. There's some great items that are teed up for maybe some progress in this General Assembly, including cash bail reform being one of the topics that may see some significant action. And there's more conversation than many of us have seen in the past as advocates about what may be the future for treating drug addiction, as well as reentry. These are all great conversations. At the moment, though, most of them are just that. Just conversations. First, though, we have to be able to undo what has been decades of a negative culture within the legislature. Back in November, the Legislative Service Commission released a research paper that showed the history of the growth of felonies within the Ohio Revised Code. In 1974, there were only 146 felonies in the Ohio Revised Code. At the time of the release of that research paper, that had grown to 752 felonies. From 146 to 752. Looking specifically at the drug chapter 2925, that had gone from an even 50 to 197 felonies. The problem is, and this really underscores the problem, the addiction that the legislature itself has to a one-trick pony approach to solving the state's opiate epidemic, is that paper released in November is already outdated. They had to release an addendum that just came out on Friday showing the 3 new felonies that were created during lame duck. Because of where we stand today with decades of negative culture, of the legislature feeling that their only response is the quick one, to punish more harshly. And it's important to also note that this is only capturing new felonies. This fails to capture anything that is the enhancement of a felony that's already on the books. A very good example, again, Gary mentioned the bill. It's a bill that the State Public Defender, the ACLU of Ohio, and AFP all oppose, and that's Senate Bill 25. Senate Bill 25 is a rehash of Senate Bill 55 from the last General Assembly, creating this idea that the state can somehow create safety bubbles around people who are in recovery and shelter them from exposure to drugs. In the meanwhile, capturing people up in arbitrary geographic zones, taking them from F4 and F5 convictions to F3s. This research paper doesn't capture those kind of enhancements. So, Jocelyn, to answer your question about good things in the trajectory forward, it's really incumbent on, will the legislators in the General Assembly learn from the lessons of our state's history, recognize that what sounds like new and innovative ideas now aren't necessarily, they've been hashed out, particularly during the 90s when we doubled the size of the felonies in the Ohio Revised Code. And are they going to actually look at data-driven solutions and recognizing that other states, such as Tennessee, have already started to draw back the arbitrary geographic zones, recognizing that those were failed policies? If that recognition happens, yes, we're in the beginning of the watershed moment, and there's some great things lying in the future for us to be able to draw down on our populations in prison, and hopefully being able to restore people who have served their time, who have paid their penance, and are hopefully able to be restored to society in a way that is fruitful, not just for the state as a whole, but for their families and for the trajectory of the state to get back onto a growth pattern.
Thank you so much, Micah. I am just really shocked to hear the increase, the drastic increase in the amount of felonies over the years. So I really appreciate your insight on that. I also want to hit on the fact that you lifted opportunity. And I just want to double tap that point because we are at the beginning of a new legislative session, only a couple weeks into it so far. We've got about 2 years to go, and there is a lot of opportunity to do some good. And as Tim mentioned, maybe not to pass reform so much as to pass bills that will be corrections. So with that, it is time for Q&A. For all of our friends in the media on the call, you should have the ability to mute, unmute yourselves. If you have a question, you're having any issues with mute, unmute, you could just drop that in the chat for me and I will lift up the question for you. Would appreciate if you could state your name and publication before asking your question. So with that, I will mute myself and open the floor to the media.
Hi, it's Andrew Welsh Huggins at the AP. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I apologize if this was in the reporter. I don't think you covered this, but I am curious, I guess for Gary, what impact has term limits had on this issue in your judgment? And without addressing term limits, what chances, given the every 2-year cycle and the big headline problem, do you think there is to actually sort of reduce these punitive bills? Thank you.
Thanks for that, Andrew. I think that definitely plays a part, but I can't quite say how much. Earlier, I explained, there's a lot of variables in play that make it hard to sort of compare session to session. And part of that is certainly term limits, in that you get new legislators, you get new chairs of committees, you get new leadership, new House Speaker, new Senate President, what have you. And so it sort of breaks that chain from previous sessions, and you're dealing with a whole bunch of new people on this issue. So that lack of consistency from session to session certainly plays a role. And one of the more frustrating things that term limits brings in is that, and you can see this when you work closely with individual legislators, is they enter the legislature many times at a certain point or a certain way of thinking. And because people like the Public Defender's Office and Americans for Prosperity and all the rest of our coalition partners and friends really start working on committee chairs and other influential people, you start to see them shift in some ways over time, that where some of what we all have to say about the failed war on drugs, that putting people in prison hurts more people than it helps. These types of things that we're continually advancing to lawmakers and influential lawmakers, that then becomes lost when they leave office. And you're dealing with whole new people, and sometimes starting really from scratch on this and having to explain to them from the start, what are the problems of an overcrowded prison system? What are the problems when our prison system is releasing about 20,000 people per year with a felony record, and the problems that they have in reestablishing their lives and themselves in society? So yes, it does play a role, and it does play a noticeable role, at least in my opinion. But there are, of course, other things in play. Micah and Tim, do you have anything to add to that?
I'll add one thing that's anecdotal. I am not an advocate for term limits. For a number of reasons, including it's almost a disappointment when the advocates are the ones with all the institutional knowledge and are having to constantly re-educate on these issues when these are not new problems. I will say, though, particularly in the House of Representatives, that we have a rather young freshman class that has just been elected. And as we have been conducting our early meetings that are largely meet and greets, hearing the difference that the younger legislators are bringing in, there's a heightened awareness of these problems and a heightened awareness that previous attempts to solve our problems have not been successful. I hope it's not too early to be optimistic. But I do think that there is an opportunity in the turnover that we're having because of term limits. Hopefully we'll find a silver lining in what is another failed policy around term limits.
Just very briefly, Andrew, I think my answer is yes. I think term limits do impact that. I think legislators need to get their name on a bill to show that they're doing something. And criminal justice bills are, I don't want to say easy, but they are responsive to constituents' complaints. They come to Columbus with an idea of something because a constituent in their district complained about a crime that was committed or some act that happened, and they want it taken care of. And we spend a lot of time then educating them about it's already against the law, it already has significant punishment or other issues. But I think there's a way to actually limit that. I do. I think, and the reason I wanted to comment is the solution. I think and it would require the legislature to take a fairly bold step. They have to pass a law imposing limits on themselves. And that would be something about like a criminal justice impact statement has to be done on the bill. You can introduce any bill you want, but they need to pass a rule that then requires it to go through a process that says, this is the impact. This is the number of beds you're going to increase in your prison. This is the number of public defenders you're going to need to hire to defend this new cases, the number of prosecutors you're going to need to hire to bring those new cases, all of the costs through the system, maybe even new judges if you're going to bring that many new cases. And then fund it. So if you're going to bring that bill, once the criminal impact statement is done, you have to add a funding line to the bill, every single bill. If you do that, you catch everybody's attention. It becomes a very real moment in time to say, wow, this bill is going to cost X number of $1 million and add X hundred of new employees to the system. And those are very non-existent conversations today, but I think they really do counter some of the problems you see with term limits and other impacts of just needing to get your name on legislation.
Thank you. Next question.
Hey, this is Mark Kovac from the Columbus Dispatch. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, good. Tim, just along with what you were just talking about and what you had to say earlier, is it ever appropriate for the legislature to just move quickly on something? And we see these bills all the time, often with weird sex crimes that turn out not to be illegal. And you'll hear people say, I can't believe that's not illegal. This guy's walking after he did that. Is it ever appropriate for the legislature to move quickly on one of these bills that, I mean, it may send 2 more people to prison, but it may, but it's not a huge population flowing into the prison system. I hope I'm making sense.
If I understand the question, my answer is legislation should always be thoughtful and considered. You should never rush legislation. And it should take, that's why we have debate. That's why we have sponsor testimony and opponent testimony and proponent testimony, because that's how it's supposed to work. And when you rush that process, you pass bills that largely don't solve the problems, or at least in the criminal justice area, my opinion is when we rush bills, we don't actually solve the problem they're trying to solve.
And to add to that, Mark, it's, I said before I talked about there's the big bills that really pack the prisons, and then there's a mess of smaller bills that will add, drops of people, let's say, to prison over the years. Those other bills, those ones that by themselves are not a huge impact, collectively they are. And that's part of what we try to get at with our pipeline report and try to point out, because that's why we highlight each and every individual bill that would send people to prison or jail. Because, and when you talk with legislators about this, and I've had many of these discussions over the years, and you talk to them about their bill and try to explain why it's not, let's say, helpful with regard to this overall problem, they will say something like, oh, that's only going to add like 10 more people to prison next year, and 15 the year after that, and so on. Sure, I get that, but when you start adding up all of these quote unquote smaller bills over time throughout a session, and session after session, that 10 over here and 5 over there and 15 over there, that's part of how we get to this larger problem, is not only those big bills, but the constant onslaught of smaller bills.
Yeah, we tend to call it mass incarceration by 1,000 cuts. Next question.
If there's nobody jumping to ask one right now, if Micah and Tim are comfortable briefly discussing it, because it hasn't explicitly come up in this conversation, and I think this continually needs to be highlighted and shouted from the mountaintops. But the role of many of Ohio's prosecutors and judges with regard to the inability of the legislature, let's say, and they are able to do it. It's just who they listen to more often than not on these problems. And I have my own opinions about the role of prosecutors and judges and why we don't see, reform with a big R. But Micah and Tim, if you would like to comment on that variable, let's say, please do.
Well, I can start if that's okay. I think people used to be, and maybe some people are still shocked by the following statement, but the most powerful person in a courtroom is the prosecutor, not the judge. And I don't think you'll find any judges who disagree with that statement anymore. I think years ago you might have, but the way the system has changed, the charging decision-making power that a prosecutor has, the sentencing guidelines that drive outcomes, all of those pieces then put, even with judicial discretion, the judge has only discretion within a certain range of how many years of prison is this person going to ultimately receive. And not whether they're going to prison, but just how long. And because of those charging decisions and the power that's happened there. With that authority, like most groups, when you create cultural groups, you tend to create sometimes echo chambers of opinions. And unfortunately, I believe that's a lot of where we see today, at least in the legislative side of policymaking. I am not speaking regarding specific prosecutors. I think there's some very fine people holding those roles across Ohio. As a policy group, however, the Ohio Prosecuting Attorneys Association says no to everything that doesn't add more time. I have yet to see them, at least in recent memory, support a bill that does anything except add more time. If it doesn't add more time, if it doesn't create a new felony, they are opposed. And they are opposed without research or without data. And that's the most frustrating piece of this, because I think there's really common ground for all of us in the justice system to build a better system. And we can agree that the data says we can have better outcomes for people, that we can have safer communities. And sadly, that's not happening. We just get opposition. And so you spend years educating legislative session after legislative session to get very small bills through. We're incredibly pleased with a couple of bills, as Gary mentioned, that passed. But some of those bills were 5-6 years in the making, with constant objection. And I think that echo chamber of more time, really, I would value an adversarial system where we both stepped back and took a look at the data and found the places that we really can agree that this makes sense. Not reform, but we're not getting good answers today. So let's get good answers. Let's correct course.
Certainly on the political side of things, we see prosecutors who are inclined even to be reform minded are shamed and denounced even by their peers. We experienced that even in the last General Assembly with one of the few prosecutors who openly spoke in favor of reform and put their name to it. That is unfortunate. And unfortunately, whenever we talk about reform, that's not uncommon. Reform typically is not a popular label for a politician to pick up, and that's nothing new. One of the things that absolutely has to change, though, is we have to align incentives as a state towards people who are, for prosecutors who are in search of truth. And I think back even to Jim Petro, who, as an attorney general, in the political blowback that he faced, And to this day, he continues to do work alongside his wife, Nancy, within this realm. In his book, Innocence that was around the Innocence Project, he did a great job of talking and illustrating with Ohio stories, just how perverse those incentives can be for just outcomes. That comes down to an educated public, though. And why, you know, the work that each of the entities that you see here matters, but also the continued good work that a number of your publications, for those I see represented on the call, of what you've done over the past several years and well, decades. That fight's not over. And so even as we talk about the good things that happened in the last General Assembly, the reason we haven't paused and said, great GA, let's pack it up, let's move on to other things, is because the fight's not over. The education's not over. And until the general public of Ohio knows what the impact is of what's happening, what a prosecutor means to their county, what a judge means to the courtroom, what it means to the community, until that happens, we haven't won anything worthwhile.
Thank you so much. I believe the 614 number was unmuting to ask a question.
Yeah, this is Laura Bischoff at Dayton Daily News. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, you're good, Laura.
Okay, so Tim, I was wondering if you could give us an update on what's going on with efforts to build out better data collection systems, so there could be more analysis done on what kind of sentences are issued and how they vary by demographics and geography.
I know there are two major systems underway right now. The Sentencing Commission is overseeing a sentencing database project to collect all the sentencing data, starting with felonies, common pleas courts across Ohio, with the then ability to look at sentencing patterns across counties and within counties. That I think is a great first effort. It's a pilot project, so I don't know when it's going to be to a statewide data set. In addition, the Office of the Ohio Public Defender, we have been creating a case management system for public defenders across Ohio, with the second level being to then collect data from what are called appointed counsel. Those are the cases that public defenders don't have enough capacity to take, or counties that don't have them. But ultimately, that will provide data on about 70 to 80% of all the criminal cases in Ohio. So that will help provide a resource to legislators and researchers to be able to guide decisions.
Do you have an ETA on when yours is going to be up and running?
We are presently in about 30 public defender counties today. We have, I think, 5 or 7 more to finish our rollout there. We should be rolling out our test bed for the appointed counsel side of the world later this calendar year, probably late in the calendar. So next year, before we see real rollout in a complete sense.
Okay, thank you for that
Thanks.
question. I'll pause again for a moment. Are there any other questions? Okay, one last question that I'm hoping each of our panelists can touch on briefly is I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the state house to prison pipeline and how mass incarceration bills affect everyday Ohioans and the people that you come into contact with.
It's devastating to families and communities. When you think about the number of people pulled out of homes in communities that have lower income areas, that are locked up and then come home without any ability to get a job because 95% of employers won't even speak to them. And obviously angry at that point because their opportunities are non-existent. They did their time, they paid their debt as they were instructed to, and have no options. And now you have a community with somebody who doesn't have income, who's been to prison, who has unfortunately been taught how to commit violent crimes. At least that's what the data tells us. And that just is devastating. You have families that are so impacted. The rates of problems in children when their parents are taken and put into prison that we don't provide good support for. And so you get expulsion rates and that are incredibly high, which turn into juvenile detention. And so suddenly you get generational problems. Obviously, another person to feed in the house takes away from an already poor income, lower income household. It impacts not just the individual when we lock somebody up who we're not doing any good by having them serve time. It impacts their immediate family, and it impacts their entire neighborhood. And when you do this across large swaths of neighborhoods, you have deep cultural impacts. That prison has long-lasting, multi-generational impact, both on people's lives and economically. It's just devastating to families.
And I think the important thing to remember is every sentence is a life sentence. When we make the decision that something is punishable by felony, we're making a lifelong determination about that individual. The question is, what are we willing to pay for it then along the way? Because we're gonna have the period that is actively in state prison, which is not inexpensive to taxpayers by any stretch, and the burgeoning budget line items for the DRC is a good indicator of that. And then once they re-enter, particularly with how we have handicapped people with felony records that are re-entering society, there's a societal cost beyond that. And as Tim just touched on, then you have the ripple effects of the family and what was the impact on the family during the time that they were taken apart. So ultimately, for how does it impact everyday Ohioans, so often it's in ways that they don't recognize. And the ultimate question comes back to, we're going to determine that any given crime is worthy of a life sentence. What are the terms that you're willing to agree to?
I will just briefly add, there's a gigantic disconnect between those people making the laws and the people who are affected by the laws. And I'm glad Tim brought up the term of generational, because particularly with the war on drugs, that has been around now for at least 2 generations. And we see, you might have a family where, grandma, dad, and now the child all unfortunately have drug problems. It has affected their family throughout for decades, and they just can't seem to get out from underneath that. And there's a whole lot of reasons that play into that, but certainly one of the biggest is that we continue to treat drug problems almost exclusively with cops, courts, and cages, and that does not work.
All right, last call for any other questions from the media. Okay, seeing none, I want to thank everyone for taking some time out of your morning to be here with us. Thank you, Micah with AFP Ohio, Tim Young, the Ohio Public Defender, and Gary with the ACLU. If anyone wants to look at our current pipeline report and compare it to the 5 other midterm and full reports that we've released, you can go to acluohio.org/pipeline. And again, thank you so much for joining us this morning for this really important discussion on mass incarceration in Ohio. Thank you.